My name is Claire, and I want to start by saying that I am not the kind of person who believes in ghosts. I was a nursing student at the time this happened, practical, trained to observe accurately, trained to separate what I see from what I feel. I say that because what I'm about to describe is something I have spent 2 years trying to explain away, and I still can't. This was the fall of 2021. I was doing a clinical rotation at a mid-sized regional hospital about 40 minutes from my university. Third floor, which was a general medical ward, nothing specialized, nothing dramatic. Patients recovering from surgeries, managing chronic conditions, that kind of thing. My shift was overnight, 12 hours, 3 nights a week. By the second month, I had the floor memorized. I knew which rooms were occupied, which were empty, which call lights tended to go off for no reason because the equipment was old. Room 318 had been empty for 3 weeks when I first noticed her. I was doing a late round, around 2 in the morning. The hallway was quiet. Most of the lights were dimmed for sleeping hours, just the low safety lighting along the baseboards and the glow from the nurse's station at the end of the corridor. I was walking the east wing, checking on a patient in 320, when I passed the window of 318 and saw a woman sitting in the chair next to the bed. I stopped walking. She was elderly. White hair, short, neatly kept. She was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, but in a pale blue color I didn't recognize from our supply. She was sitting upright in the chair with her hands folded in her lap, looking toward the window. Not at me, just at the window which faced the parking structure across the street. My first thought was that a patient had wandered in from another room. It happens sometimes with elderly patients, especially at night, confusion, disorientation. I went to the nurse's station and checked the board. Room 318 was empty and had been flagged as empty for maintenance. No patient assigned. I went back to the room and opened the door. She was still there, still sitting in exactly the same position, still looking at the window. I said hello. I told her my name and that I was one of the nurses on the floor tonight. I asked if she was okay, if she knew where she was, if she needed anything. She turned her head slowly and looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a completely calm expression, not confused, not frightened, not the way disoriented patients usually look. She looked at me the way you'd look at someone you were expecting. Then she turned back to the window. I went immediately to get my supervisor, a charge nurse named Patricia who had been working that floor for 11 years. I told her exactly what I'd seen and where. She gave me a patient look, the kind experienced nurses give students who are overwhelmed, and walked down the hall with me to room 318. The room was empty. Chair was in the corner where it always sat. Bed was stripped. Nobody there. Patricia checked the hallway in both directions. She checked the bathroom inside the room. She came back out and told me gently that overnight shifts do strange things to the brain, especially when you're new. She said she'd worked this floor for over a decade and strange things felt normal after a while. She meant it kindly. I nodded and went back to work. But it happened again 3 nights later. Same room, same chair, same woman in the pale blue gown. This time it was closer to 4 in the morning, and I was alone in the east wing, doing charting near the supply closet. I looked up and she was visible through the small window in the room's door, just sitting there in the dark, faintly lit by the parking structure lights through the exterior window. I didn't get my supervisor this time. I took out my phone and took a photo through the door window before I did anything else. Then I opened the door, empty. I looked at the photo immediately. The room in the image was dark. The chair was there. There was a shape in the chair, indistinct, the phone camera struggling with the low light, but something was there. A massive pale color where the woman had been sitting. I showed it to 2 other nurses on my shift. One of them said it was probably the light reflecting off the chair's upholstery. The other one looked at it for a long time and then handed my phone back without saying anything. I started researching the room after that. Not official records, I didn't have access to patient histories, but I asked around carefully. An older orderly named Jean, who had worked the floor for years, told me, without me mentioning the woman, that room 318 used to make staff uncomfortable. He said there had been a patient who spent a long time in that room years ago. An elderly woman. She had no family, no visitors. She died in that room on a winter night during a quiet shift, alone, sitting up in the chair because she said lying in the bed made her feel like she was already in a coffin. He said her name was Margaret. I never saw her again after that night. I finished my rotation 2 months later and was assigned to a different hospital for my next placement. I never told my clinical supervisor what Jean told me, and I never filed any kind of report. I still have the photo on my phone. I've looked at it probably 200 times. Most days I can almost convince myself it's just the chair. Most days. My name is Tom. I grew up in a small town in rural Vermont, in a house that sat on about 3 acres at the end of a long gravel driveway. The nearest neighbor was maybe a quarter mile away. I lived there from birth until I left for college at 18, and for most of that time I thought it was a perfectly ordinary house in a perfectly ordinary place. What I'm about to describe started when I was 12 and lasted, on and off, for almost 3 years. The first time was a Tuesday evening in late October. I remember the season because the leaves had mostly come down and the trees were bare, which meant you could see farther through the property than you could in summer. I was upstairs in my bedroom doing homework near the window that faced the front of the house and the driveway. There was a boy standing at the end of the driveway. He was about my age, maybe a year or two younger. He was wearing clothes that looked slightly wrong for the weather, a light shirt and dark pants, no jacket, no coat, even though it was cold enough that I could see my breath when I'd been outside earlier. He was just standing there at the point where the driveway met the road, looking at the house. I watched him for a minute, trying to figure out who he was. I knew every kid in the area. We went to a small school. There were not many of us. I didn't recognize him. I went downstairs and told my mom there was a kid at the end of the driveway. She looked out the kitchen window and said she didn't see anyone. I went to the front door and looked out. The driveway was empty. She suggested it was probably someone from the road who'd stopped to look at something and moved on. I went back upstairs. He was there again. Same spot, same position, just looking at the house. I watched him for almost 10 minutes that time. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't look away, didn't react when a car passed on the road behind him. He just stood there with this completely neutral expression, staring at the house. At some point I looked down at my homework for a few seconds, and when I looked back up, he was gone. I told my dad at dinner. He asked a few practical questions. Did I recognize him? Was he doing anything? Was anyone with him? And when I said no to all of them, he said it was probably just a kid from town who got lost or was looking for a friend's house. He said if I saw him again to come get him. I saw him again 6 more times over the next 2 months. Always at the end of the driveway. Always in the same light clothes regardless of the temperature. Always in the late afternoon or early evening, around the time the light was going flat and gray. Always just standing. Always gone within minutes if I looked away, even briefly. The 4th or 5th time, I managed to get my dad to come upstairs and look before the boy disappeared. My dad stood at my window for a moment. I pointed to the end of the driveway. My dad looked for a long time. He said he didn't see anything. I was looking at a boy standing in plain sight at the end of our driveway, and my father, standing next to me at the same window, saw nothing. That was the moment it stopped feeling like something I could explain. I tried to describe the boy in as much detail as I could to my parents. They were patient about it, but I could tell they were moving from mild concern to something closer to worry, not about the boy, about me. My mom asked if I'd been sleeping okay, if anything stressful was happening at school. My dad suggested I get my eyes checked. I got my eyes checked. My vision was fine. The last time I saw him was the winter I was 14. It was a Sunday afternoon, overcast, about an inch of snow on the ground. I was coming back from a friend's house down the road, walking up our driveway, when I realized he was standing about 30 feet ahead of me. I had never been that close before. He was standing in the middle of the driveway facing the house, his back to me. I could see the details I'd never been able to make out from the window: dark hair, slightly too long. The thin shirt, which was a faded blue, no shoes. His feet were bare in the snow. I stopped walking. He turned around slowly. His face was the same age as the rest of him, young, maybe 10 or 11. But his expression was completely adult. Not frightened, not curious, tired. The way someone looks when they've been waiting somewhere for a very long time. We looked at each other for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then he looked past me down the driveway toward the road, and his expression changed slightly. Like he saw something there. Like something he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. I turned around instinctively to look. There was nothing on the road. Just the empty street and the bare trees. When I turned back, he was gone. I never saw him again after that day. I've thought about him for years, who he might have been, why he was always at the end of the driveway, what he was looking at when he stared at our house for all those hours across all those years. A few years ago, I was visiting my parents, and I mentioned it to my mom, now that enough time had passed that it felt like something I could talk about without her worrying. She listened to the whole thing quietly. When I finished, she told me something she'd never mentioned before. She said that years before we moved in, a young boy had gone missing in the area. Never found. The family had lived somewhere on our road. She said she'd never told me because she didn't want to scare me. She didn't say she believed me. She didn't say she didn't. She just looked at her coffee and said she'd always wondered why I stopped wanting to be near the front windows after I turned 12. My name is Andrea. This is about my grandmother's house, a family reunion, and something that took me 4 years to fully accept I had actually seen. My grandmother lived alone in a 2-story house in a small town in Georgia. She'd lived there for almost 50 years, raised her children there, watched her husband die there, kept the house going on her own into her late 70s. It was a big house for one person. High ceilings, old wood floors, rooms that stayed cool in summer in that particular way old Southern houses do. Every few years, the extended family would come together there for a reunion: cousins, aunts, uncles, people I only saw every few years and had to relearn every time. The reunion I'm describing happened in the summer of 2018. About 25 people spread across the house in the backyard for a long weekend. I was 23 at the time, the youngest adult in my family, which meant I spent most of the weekend half listening to conversations and scrolling my phone on the back porch. On the second day, someone decided we should take a proper family photo. My uncle set up a tripod in the backyard and we arranged ourselves in 3 rows, the older generation seated in front, middle-aged relatives standing behind them, and the younger cousins in the back. It took about 15 minutes to get everyone positioned. My uncle took 6 or 7 shots with the timer. That evening, my cousin Maya was going through the photos on the camera and called a few of us over to look. They were good shots, everyone was in frame, most people were smiling, the light was decent. We were passing the camera around, laughing at expressions, doing what families do with reunion photos. Then my cousin Seth stopped laughing. He handed the camera to me without saying anything and pointed at the screen. In the back row, slightly to the left of center, there was a woman standing behind my relatives. She was not a member of our family. She was older, significantly older than anyone at the reunion. She was wearing a dark dress that looked nothing like what anyone had worn that day. She was standing very straight, hands at her sides, looking directly at the camera. Not smiling, not frowning, just looking. I went through all 6 photos. She was in every single one. Same position, same expression, same dress. Completely still while everyone around her had shifted slightly between shots the way people do. I looked up from the camera at the backyard. There was no one there who matched what I was seeing in the photos. I went through the group of relatives nearby and tried to match faces. There was no match. I showed the photo to my mother. She studied it for a long time and then said it was probably a neighbor who had wandered into the frame and none of us had noticed. Our grandmother's backyard backed up to other properties. It was plausible that someone could have been visible through the fence line. But there was no fence line visible in the photo. The woman was standing directly behind the back row of our family. Not beyond a fence, not at a distance. Behind them, close enough that she should have been impossible to miss. I showed it to my aunt, who looked at it briefly and said the same thing, probably a neighbor. I showed it to my uncle, who had taken the photos. He studied it for longer than anyone else, zooming in on his camera screen. He said something about the exposure creating artifacts and strange shapes in bright light. He said it calmly, but he handed the camera back quickly and changed the subject. Nobody wanted to look at it for very long. That night I couldn't sleep. I was in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the one that had apparently been my mother's as a child. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to get water. The hallway was dark except for a nightlight near the bathroom at the end. I was almost to the stairs when I stopped. There was someone standing in the hallway near my grandmother's room. The same woman from the photos. Same dress, same posture, looking at me. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like a long time, but it was probably only a few seconds. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood in the hallway in the dark and looked at me with the same expression she'd had in every photo, attentive, calm, present. Then she wasn't there. No movement. No door opening, no sound. She was there and then she was gone the way a thought is gone when something interrupts it. I went back to my room and sat on the bed with the light on until morning. I told my mother in the car on the drive home. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said that when she was a girl, she used to see a woman in that hallway sometimes. She had told her parents when she was young, and they had told her it was dreams. She had eventually stopped mentioning it. She had never told me before because she didn't want me to be frightened of going to my grandmother's house. I asked her what the woman had looked like. She described the same dress, the same posture, the same expression. My grandmother passed away the following year. The house was sold to a family outside of ours. I don't know if they've seen anything. I've thought about reaching out to them and decided against it every time. I still have the photos. I've looked at them more times than I can count, trying to see what my aunt and uncle saw, an artifact, a reflection, a neighbor through a fence. 25 people in that backyard. 25 people arranging themselves and waiting while my uncle fussed with the tripod and the timer. Nobody saw her. Nobody but the camera.